Okay. Apologies in advance if the video is jumping a little bit. I've tried turning it off and turning it on and it's not working, but hopefully it will sort itself out in a minute. But thank you for joining me, Mira and Sarah. I just wanted to have a bit of a chat today about the realities of our debut year and how it went and what we kind of expected versus what actually ended up happening. And yeah, just nice, honest chat, because I think there's sometimes a misconception about the debut year. We hear a lot about the fancy six-figure deals and the instant bestsellers and Richard and Judy picks and all of this. And it can feel quite discouraging if that's not you. And it's not actually the norm. The norm is much less shiny than that. So I just want to have a chat about that. So before we jump in, let's have a quick introduction to our guests. So Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself and your books?
Yeah, so my name is Sarah Bonner and I write psychological thrillers. My debut was Her Perfect Twin, which came out last January in hardback and then in the summer in paperback. And this tells the story of Megan, who kind of accidentally kills her identical twin and then tries to get away with it by living both their lives. And then last week, my second novel came out, which is Her Sweet Revenge, which is the story of Thea, who is out to get revenge for her best friend's murder. And that came out in hardback and ebook last week, and then the paperback will be coming in the summer as well.
And Mira, do you want to introduce yourself and your novel?
Sarah, you're a pro. I just don't want to go on.
I may have done this a few times.
So I'm a pretty newbie. So my debut novel, Her, it came out in March, the 23rd of March in ebook, and it is due to come out in paperback in November. And it's sort of a domestic noir psychological suspense novel set in North London. And it tells the story of Rani and Natalie, two very different women from sort of different backgrounds, different worlds, whose lives collide and their lives unravel, really. And basically just ask the question, as a woman, can you really have it all? So, yeah.
And I have read all of those books and can attest that they are all brilliant. So before we jump too much into what our debut years were like, or are like for Mira, you're still in your debut year. Before we jump too much into that, I would really love to explore why we think it's so taboo to talk about this subject, because I don't know about you, but I feel like no one ever talks about this side of it. Everyone talks about the good and the shiny, and it's not very often spoken about, which is why I wanted to do this video. It's not often spoken about the sort of less shiny side of it. So Mira, do you want to maybe give us some thoughts about why you think it might be taboo? Because I know you've had some backlash recently. Do you want to?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, this when you sort of invited me on, I sort of didn't even have to think twice. I was just like, yes, because I, like yourself, Becca, and like yourself, Sarah, feel like there is sort of a need for more maybe transparency, more honesty about the realities, because I, for one, had sort of no idea what I was in for at all. And all I could see published on the bookseller were like the big, shiny six-figure deals that Becca referred to, and, the overnight preempts and all that kind of glamorous life of being an author. I don't have a publishing background. I don't have a journalist background. I actually was a city lawyer for many years, and then sort of have stayed within the legal sphere. So I don't have any connections. So all I kind of knew was what I was reading about in the press, which sort of gave a very different perception and different experience to what mine has been, and from what I've learned since from other authors. So I actually recently wrote an article in the bookseller. You can still sort of find it on the website, and that kind of gave a picture of what the reality is like for me as an author, what it means in terms of how I can actually make a living from this, which sort of the long and short of it is I can't make a living from this profession currently as it stands. I have a day job, and that is genuinely the only way I can make it work. And I think that's quite similar to a lot of people. So yeah, Sarah, what do you think about it?
So it's an interesting one, because I do think there is a there is a tendency with something like writing for us to feel, I think, grateful for the opportunity, to a point that no one ever wants to say it isn't perfect. And I think there is a, you don't want to be the person going, oh, my glass slippers are a little bit too tight, because no one else wants to hear that. And it's only when you start talking to other authors who have had similar experiences that you realize that actually it is fairly ubiquitous for it to not necessarily be everything that you'd maybe dreamed it was, or everything that other people think it is for you. I mean, I've lost count of the number of times people said to me, oh, second novel, you must be a millionaire by now. Like, maybe in some currencies, but certainly not here. And so I do think that is something that we don't generally talk about. I don't know about anyone else, but I am very much the kind of person that publicly I will tend to talk about the good, but not necessarily about the bad. Mainly just, that's just the way I am. And so I think if you looked at my social media, you'd see it's all rosy and lovely, and not the kind of stuff that sits underneath it that we don't necessarily talk about, and the self-doubt that comes with that, and all of the other stuff that you end up doing. So I didn't work during my debut year. And a lot of people said to me, oh, you're writing full time. And I was like, well, no, I just don't have a job because my industry got kind of destroyed by COVID. And I subsequently have now gone back to work because my industry's bounced back. But it's not necessarily, particularly in the early years, viable to do it full time. And particularly not if you, if you live somewhere that's fairly expensive. So Becca and I actually live fairly close to each other. We're about 20 minutes drive. And it's not a cheap place to live. And so that makes things even more difficult. But yeah, I think there is definitely a bit of a stigma attached with having honest conversations about the reality of it.
I think you, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think the other people who are watching this video, probably a lot of my audience are sort of aspiring authors. They're looking to get published. They're maybe writing their query letters or polishing that novel, aiming to query. They're pursuing traditional publishing. So this to them is, where we are, that's where they want to be. And they would, give their right arm to be where we are. And I think that then means that when we do have these conversations about it not necessarily being all rosy, that sometimes they can say, well, that's so ungrateful. Like, you should be so grateful to be where you are. And I think the danger of it is, if we only talk about the good, then what can happen is those people who are looking to get traditionally published will have a very clear idea in their head of what they think it's going to be like. And when it inevitably isn't like that, because it's not the norm to have those shiny deals and the, splashy tables in Waterstones and things, if that's not what they get, then you can end up feeling really discouraged. You can feel like you're not good enough, that your writing's not good enough. And it could be that you actually end up deciding that maybe this industry isn't for you at all. And so I think it is important that we do have these conversations, just so that people have a really realistic idea of what to expect, rather than, going through their debut year and then feeling very discouraged and potentially giving up.
Yeah, and I think there is definitely I think the reality is that I wouldn't not have done what I've done, and I wouldn't not have pursued traditional publishing. And I'm incredibly grateful to have had the opportunity, because I think there is a huge element of luck in publishing, and there is a lot of the stars have to align in a certain way. And I don't want to appear ungrateful, and I would absolutely do this all over again. But I think if I'd known the realities going into it, I think a couple of things. I think I would have enjoyed the highs a lot better. I would have appreciated a lot more some of those key milestones for what they really were and what they really represented. But then I think as well, when things weren't as good, I think then it becomes easier to kind of chalk it up as, well, that's just how things are, and you move on much more easily.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think maybe it's like for someone that's not part of an industry, part of the publishing industry, that doesn't know how publishing works. I think it's hard to appreciate, one, how many books are published, and two, sort of how publishing works, sort of how maybe the marketing budget is allocated, how the publicity budget is allocated, how sales work, and all of this stuff that as a debut author, an aspiring author, you won't really know about. And once you acquire that information, then actually things become clearer to you, and you have a sense of like, wow, okay, and now I can adjust my expectations accordingly. But at the start, you don't have that knowledge, and that knowledge has to be acquired quickly in order for you to sort of acknowledge, this is how my career is going to look, and this is how the reality, of my career is going to take shape, really. My agent, actually, I think that's the benefit of having an agent, is they can be that sort of sense of honesty, to hold your hand through it. And my agent's always said to me from like day one, from, the very second she offered me representation, this is very much a marathon. It's not a sprint. So, you want to be in this career, you want to be successful, we will make you a bestseller. We will make you, a whatever, Sunday Times bestseller. But it may not take, it may take 2 books, it may take 3 books, it may take 5 books, it may take 10 books, that you need to sort of aim, see it as a long-term goal. And I think, on the flip side of that, that is tough, because for many aspiring authors, it takes months, years, decades to write their first novel. So the very thought of spending all that time on your first novel and then have to see it as a marathon and think, I've spent 10 years on book one. How I don't have another 10 years to spend on book two. Like, so I think that's sort of the sort of conflict that we have. So yeah.
Yeah, I I love what you said about marathon, not a sprint, though. Like, I want to put that up on my wall somewhere, because it is so true, and it's something that I'm constantly having to remind myself of. And also Sarah saying about the highs, because I don't want this to be a doom and gloom video. The highs really are amazing. Like when we see good reviews come in, and when we have someone tell us that they're reading our book and that they love it and they've recommended it to a friend, like those moments are absolutely priceless. And I think that's what keeps us going. But yeah, it's just sort of being aware before you jump into it with too high expectations, so that you don't come sort of crashing down. So talking about expectations, that leads me nicely on to the next question, which was, what were your expectations going into your debut year, before you sort of started to experience it? What were you sort of expecting it to be like? Sarah, do you want to start this time?
Oh, it's such a difficult question, because I think like most of us, I don't come from a publishing background or from that world at all. I'm an accountant by trade, so couldn't really be any more different. So I didn't really have any sense of what normal or what to expect at all. And I think there is a little bit of an element in that first year that you start to see what's happening with other people as well, and maybe you get a bit of a feel as to how, like, where your book sits in the hierarchy of your kind of publisher, and therefore how much of a push it's going to get. But I think the one thing that really surprised me was placement in bookshops. So I was under the impression that if you have a traditional publishing deal, you will be in bookshops like Waterstones, like Smiths, etc. And that is not necessarily the case. And I remember on kind of waking up on publishing day, like, oh my God, it's published. And then discovering that the nearest Waterstones that had a copy was Central London. And so there were no copies in my local area. There was no going round and signing in bookshops or anything. And that was a bit of a, oh, okay. Had not realized that was a thing. Okay. And to be fair to my publisher, they did then kind of ring round and find some places that had some stock. But it was also in that weird new wave of Omicron, so some stuff wasn't open anyway, so it was all a bit weird at the time anyway. But yeah, that was certainly a bit of a surprise, because I'd assumed, well, it's gonna be in shops. And then there was a bit of a managing other people's expectation then that came out of that. So a lot of people were messaging me and saying, well, I can't find a copy of it. And I'm like, Waterstones didn't pick it up, so it's not in stores. So and that was a bit of a, if I'd known that that was something that was likely to happen, I think I would have prepared myself for that a little bit better, rather than it being a bit of a disappointment. I would have then felt that it was good when I did find a copy. Like, do you know what I mean? I think I would have just approached it with a slightly different mindset. So that for me was the big one, that I just hadn't realized in advance.
I think at the moment it's really common as well. I think in general Waterstones are just stocking so few books at the moment. So many debut authors I've spoken to have said, well, my book's not in Waterstones, I don't understand. And it's so common at the moment, and I don't think anyone realizes that when they go into it. So that's a big sort of misconception, I think. Mira, what were you expecting from your debut year?
So I'm going to come at it a little slightly sort of earlier to Sarah, because as I mentioned previously, my book is currently only out in ebook. So I have the wonderful shop stuff to look forward to in November. For me, I think one of the key sort of things was how much maybe little say you have about certain things. So for example, like the cover, that very much sort of is publisher's domain. So, you can give your opinion, and I think maybe each sort of author's experience is different, but certainly for mine, it was very much sort of like, the publisher has the wealth of experience, knows what kind of will sell, it will know, how to reach certain audiences and things like that. So, how, I think, I'm not sure if everyone has this, but everyone has a picture of what their cover might look like one day. When I was writing it, I was thinking, oh, this is very much the women's story. I'd love to have the women on the cover. But actually, in the end, it was sort of, for me, it was about the house. And that was what publishers decided. So it's kind of things like that, where actually when a publisher buys your book, it's not just your book anymore. I mean, it's very much not your book. It's sort of a joint effort. It's sort of everyone's book, essentially. So that's sort of an example of that, but also the reviews. So a lot of books go on like the NetGalley. If people haven't heard of it, it's sort of an early review platform where readers can obtain the book for free, or sort of on the promise of like an honest review, basically. And I think that's one of the things that kind of like hit me, is that like, wow, like how much of an impact reviews would have on you. Like I didn't anticipate like feeling certain things, and I didn't anticipate sort of, I mean, everyone tells you, oh, it's going to be like tough, and like, there'll be ups and downs, you'll get some brilliant reviews, you'll get some not so brilliant reviews, but I didn't anticipate how it would make me feel. So I think that was quite hard. So yeah, it's kind of things like the experiences that I guess you're not prepared for, and then when it sort of comes up, it takes you by surprise. So yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think for me, the biggest shock was just the relentlessness of it. So I had this vision of publication day for my debut being this incredible day. I'd wake up in the morning and feel like, oh, I'm an author.
Yeah.
But actually I woke up and felt exactly the same. And then by that point, I was already working on book 2, and I was so focused on book 2 and, getting it drafted, that book 1 was already done to me. It was, even though it was publication day, it was already in the past, and it was already, I'm on to the next thing now. And that's always been the case. It was the same for my second one. I was already focusing on book 3. I've just submitted my edits for book 3. And now I'm already working on book 4, because my deadlines are so tight, because I'm with a digital first publisher. So I know that when publication day comes round for book 3, it's not going to mean anything to me, because I'm going to be so focused on doing book 4. And it is just that relentless, like, you can never really take a breather, because you're always focusing on the next thing, and you're always, and I think sometimes it is good to take a breather, and it's, you know, you need to have those times where you maybe say to your agent, like, I really need a break and I need to push my deadline back, or whatever is needed for your sort of mental health. I talk a lot about author mental health on this channel, and yeah, I think it's the difficult days can really get to you, especially as you feel sometimes that you're sort of on your own, plugging away, getting this done. And you've got this big team around you, so you're not actually on your own, but you are still the one sat at the keyboard, and it does feel like all the weight is on your shoulders. So
that's such a good point that you touched on, Becca, is that it's never just one book. And I think people, you know, when I've spoken to my friends, they're like, oh, you're working on your next book? What? You've already written your second book? What? And they can't understand that it's like, it's not just one book. Like, when you're an author, you are writing one, you're editing another, and you're publishing the third one. So it generally, a lot of the time, it is you're working on 3 books at one time, which, as you've said, is a lot. And so,
but you have to. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And if you want to turn it into a career, you have to be constantly
churning
about the next thing.
Certainly in commercial. I think literary is different, isn't it? Where literary, you can kind of, the expectation is less churning a book a year, but for commercial, yeah.
Yeah, I think the other thing as well that I hadn't necessarily been prepared for was how slow everything is. And so by the time your book actually comes out, it's probably been 2 years since you actually wrote it. And so, you know, and I remember last year doing podcasts and things, and I'd have to write the names of my characters on Post-it notes and stick them around my computer, because I'm terrible with names at the best of times. But I was like, I'm going to get the names wrong, and that's going to be really embarrassing. But it's because I'd written it 2 years previously. So, you know, there are these huge swathes of time where you're just kind of waiting for stuff to happen, and you're writing stuff in the background, but I hadn't quite fathomed how slow it was. And to be fair, mine was fairly quick in relative terms. I saw a post the other day that someone had put on Twitter to say they just seen an announcement for a book coming in 2027.
No.
Wow.
How is that?
A book, but
how do they need that much lead-in time? That's insane.
So I think it was bought on proposal, so that hadn't actually been
non-fiction.
No, I think it's fiction, but on proposal, because it's someone that's fairly well known. But you just go like, are we really working 4 years in advance? And to be fair, from idea, if you're in a traditional book a year, I know, Becca, yours is faster because you're publishing every 6 months or so. But you can be looking at 2-3 years between certainly having an idea and seeing your book on the shelves. And yeah, that was a bit of a.
I think that's a really good point, actually. It does feel slow, and not only does it feel slow, it feels like nothing's happening. So you're kind of like, there'll be times where you don't hear from your editor for months, and you yourself are thinking, oh, is that something I've done wrong? Or like, you know, they're not thinking about me, they don't care about me. Yeah, exactly. She hated my edits, she hated everything about it. But it's not that, because when you speak to other authors, they also say, oh, I haven't heard from my editor for months. Like, that's nothing to worry about. It's normal, because just because they're not in constant communication with you doesn't mean that things aren't going on behind the scenes. So yeah, I think that's important, because us writers are very needy people. So I think there is a tendency to think that they've forgotten about us, but that's definitely not the case. So
yeah, I suppose it's that thing, isn't it, that for us, our books are our single most important thing, because they are our books, whereas your editor might be working on 6 or more books at a time. And you know, I mean, I work in projects as part of my day job, and there are times where I will put something down and go, well, I'll deal with that next week. And I imagine that's exactly what they're doing, because you know, you only have a certain amount of bandwidth to juggle with at any one time. So but yeah, then I'm sitting there going, is it because she hates my book?
Yeah, exactly.
And of course it's not. It's just, you know, she's got like 20 other things.
Yeah.
And not like stroking my ego is not important.
It must be so strange for them, because I feel like agents, they have to be like agents, friends, psychotherapists, all of this stuff. That's like the hardest job in the world. I wouldn't want to be an agent.
I bet they go to the pub and they're like, oh my God, my client. They just
Oh God, Sarah emailed me again.
Yeah.
And I think I'm fairly low maintenance in
Yeah.
relative terms, but even so, yeah.
That's exactly, I always get the information, oh, you don't need any hand holding. I'm like, are you kidding? Like, how many emails sit in my draft that I haven't sent to you?
Yeah, I do have it is that I'll write something and then just kind of like put it in draft. And then if I still want to send it the next day, then that's fine.
Yeah, that's a very good tip.
Very good tip. Speaking of tips, I'm aware that we're sort of running out of time on the call. If it does cut us off, I'm sure we can just jump onto another one and that'll be fine. I can splice them together. But I just wanted to ask you guys if you could give a tip to a debut author in terms of sort of preparing themselves for their debut year, what would it be? Mira, do you want to go first?
Yeah, okay. The tip. Whew. I think we've touched on a lot of tips, but I think the biggest thing would be is to not get swayed by this made up word, which you'll know what it means anyway, comparisonitis. I don't know. I've seen this term dotted around quite a bit on Twitter, but effectively, because the writing community can feel like a tiny bubble, and as soon as you go on Twitter, you've got like announcement of a TV deal, you've got foreign rights announcements left, right, and center. And I think, especially if you're part of a debut group as well, which are amazing because you've got colleagues who understand what you're going through, and they can be your first port of call for everything. But the flip side of that is that there's like so much good news in that, and sometimes it can feel like, you know, all the good stuff is happening to other people and not yourself, and that can get you down. And I think, you know, I spent a lot of maybe the sort of latter half of last year, or perhaps the beginning of last year, just my emotions were like a roller coaster, just triggered by stuff that wasn't happening to me. And I think because I was sort of slightly slower, you know, my paperback's not coming out till November, so things like publicity stuff won't start until, you know, at least September. So for all that kind of press stuff won't be happening for me, whereas all my sort of lovely fellow debuts, you know, they were getting all this kind of coverage, and it made me feel quite down. I think, you know, my book's not going to be successful, it's not going to be anywhere. But I think that's the thing, every single book and every single author has their own journey, and it's completely different. And I think it's just so important for us to remember that our time will come, and it you know, it may not be the same as everyone else, but something good will happen at some point. So yeah, just it's easier said than done, and you do what you have to do to kind of shut yourself off from it. Have a Twitter break, have a social media break, whatever you need. But I think, yeah, it's important to remember that.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Sarah, what about you?
Can I do two, or is that greedy?
No, you can.
So first one is to make sure that you do celebrate all the good stuff and don't get caught up in like the comparisonitis, and think, well, therefore my good thing isn't as good as someone else's good thing. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, you've published a book, you've done the thing that no one else ever does. Like, how many other, like, obviously now, sorry, my dog's just walked in
on cue.
You know, you've written and published a book, and that is a huge achievement in and of itself. So take every moment when all of those incredibly exciting milestones happen, when you get your cover for the first time, where you first see it typeset on your page proofs, when you get physical proofs if your publisher does those, when you get your box of author copies, right, you know, all of those things, make sure that you celebrate them and enjoy them, and just kind of, yeah, just make sure that you are enjoying it. And because ultimately this is something that we do because we enjoy it, and, you know, have fun with it. And then the other thing kind of links a little bit to what Mira was saying about not comparing yourself with other people. And things like debut groups are great because you get to meet other authors, but they can become quite quickly but I'm not getting what they're getting, and by, you know, and those kind of things. So I think my other piece of advice is find authors who you trust, to make smaller groups where you can have those honest conversations. So like the three of us have a WhatsApp group, so that if things are not going as well, you've got someone to say, look, you know, am I right to feel this way? Is this just me being a bit big? And you've got that kind of checks and balances, and you've got that safe space to have those conversations. And I think that's really important. And if you don't know any other authors, talk to your agent or talk to your editor and get them to put you in touch with other people. And particularly your agent is a great one, because they've probably got a broader range of clients at different publishing houses as well, and you know, they'll put you together so that you can, you know, have those kind of relationships and those friendships with other authors, because ultimately, you know, for me, the biggest highlight of my debut year, aside from having a book with my name on it, is all the incredible people that I've met along the way. And actually putting it into those terms makes me feel incredibly grateful for that opportunity, because it's been more than just publishing a book.
That's so true, Sarah, because people always say it's really hard to make friendships in adult life, but I think I've made more friends since I've, you know, joined the writing community than I have in a long time. And real friendships, we don't just talk about writing, we talk about other stuff as well. So that's like such good advice, like find your people. Yeah.
Such a lovely high note to end on, and I think we're about to get cut off. So thank you so much, Sarah and Mira, for joining me and for having this lovely, honest chat. And I really hope it's been helpful to some of you out there. And ladies, I will catch you on WhatsApp.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye.